Hello, my name is Ryan Williams, and I'm writing a doctoral thesis on social media in education. I'm coming to the end of my research now, and I thought I would do a video on how I have become very reflexive during this process. I come from a quantitative background, so I've primarily dealt with data being reliable and valid. So talking about credibility of research and researcher reflexivity is fairly new to me, or it was at the start of this process. So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I became reflexive and the differences between being reflective and reflexive as a researcher. So being reflective is reflecting on the data and making judgments about that data. Reflexivity takes this a little bit further, and it typically involves examining my judgments, practices, and the beliefs and values during the data collection process. And the goal of being reflexive is to identify any personal beliefs or values that may have affected the researcher. So all this is done to add credibility to your research results by reducing researcher bias. For example, if I'm a big social media advocate, those beliefs and values and opinions may have potentially impacted the study's outcomes. So here we're talking about the credibility of my research and not necessarily the validity at the end. Reflexivity is generally associated with qualitative research, and some of the benefits include accountability, trustworthiness, clarity, personal growth. So the ability to identify these biases and beliefs and characteristics that may have potentially affected the work. So how I approach this is that I reflected quite a lot during the write-up. I firstly reflected using blogs and vlogs, and I included some personal reflections in my thesis at the end of every chapter, just a bit of kind of really personal accounts of how I approached this chapter, some of the challenges I had, 500 words or so. I did this at the end of every chapter. I also had regular discussions with my supervisor, and I think that's important to as part of that reflective process. So my reflexive approach included continuous reflections on myself as a researcher, and how, as well as how this critical examination impacts the power relations in the research context, such as my methodology and how my approach may have impacted the results. So one of the big examples was how the interviews were analysed. They were analysed using thematic analysis, and that involved a lot of interpretation by the researcher, by me. So what I did to just reduce that researcher bias is I had a phase one before I got onto the interviews, and this consisted of surveys, and they were analysed quantitatively, and I was able to generate some key themes from them. So when I got onto the qualitative part, the thematic analysis for the interviews, I already had a few key themes that had already begun emerging. It was quite a useful exercise, because during this whole reflexive and reflective approach, I became very aware of my researcher bias and some of the attitudes and opinions that saw the data being looked through by a particular lens. So I really had to become attuned in how I was going to minimise this, or any other misunderstandings, or any other research bias in general. I ensured that the interviews that I conducted were open-ended, and this allowed for any unanticipated issues to be raised. Again, I didn't want to exclude any information that didn't fit with my beliefs or values. I think closed questions would not have provided this benefit. I also avoided using leading questions, and I think all this links back into that reflexive approach to reduce researcher bias. Furthermore, I avoided interrupting participants. I did consider at times to bring them back on track, but I think it's evidenced in my thematic analysis map that there were times where it did look like it was drifting off, but it did come back into the social media context. So one of the examples was school meals, when we had the scenario about pupils working at home, didn't have access to these free school meals. So at times teachers begun talking about that, but it did link in back round into some of the societal challenges that children have in terms of they might not have access to Wi-Fi at home as well. Being reflexive gave confidence to validate my results as it examined my own judgments through the data collection process. All the data collected was researcher-led, so I led the surveys, I led the interviews, so being reflexive was important. This also enhanced the credibility of my research, but also evidences some personal growth in this area, the ability to identify researcher bias. Thank you for watching. My thesis is now submitted and my Viva is scheduled, so my next video will be on reflecting on that Viva experience. Thank you again.